Hey guys, Moshi Mochi here, and we're back with the Portalcraft Stereo Rebellion Take 2 Draft Infographic update. So Portalcraft is sort of seeing a shift back to sort of its artifact value roots compared to sort of a mid-range puppet game plan that they had in the past, mainly because of sort of the matchups they have in the past compared to now, and what they sort of have to deal with. In the past, they had to deal with things like Sword, Haven, and Rune, where Haven and Rune, they were much more defensive crafts that you actually had to be the aggressor against, so you actually had to play a lot more 2-drops, a lot more 3-drops, in order to actually beat them out in the value game. You had to go faster than them. And for Sword, even though you had better value than them, sometimes they were too fast for you, and then you just get overwhelmed. So you needed to still have a right ratio of just high amounts of 2-drops and 3-drops to actually keep up on curve before you can actually establish like a few of your late drops to actually win the game. So that mainly just changes the changelog for like these two sections, where you can value more defensive drops, more value late game drops, because the matchups you face now are just like the Portalcraft mirror, as well as just Shadow and Rune, just a lot of high value crafts that just play defensively to the late game. You don't see a lot of sort of aggressive crafts, a lot of crafts that actually aim to sort of tempo you out now. The closest thing we have is just a really good sword draft, or maybe a dragon draft that's really aggressive, but Portal can always deal with those with just a good defensive array of just 3-drops, 4-drops, and just puppet cards and evos. So they don't have to worry too much about that, and they can just fall back to sort of the good old grindy value game, which they're very good at, as well as just some new artifact cards to sort of help them in the pool. First up for the new cards, we got the Augmentation Bestowal. So it's a 1 play point Portalcraft spell that rewards you for playing multiple artifacts in a turn. It recovers 1 play point and then draws 1 card for each. Thing to note is the bifurcating artifacts, it's the 3 play points that makes a 2/2 and then summons another 2/2. It'll actually count for 2 procs for this, so it'll actually recover 2 and then draw you 2 cards. So that's like a thing to know. But it suffers from like the same as like any other artifacts you shuffle into the deck. There's not a lot of ways to sort of fetch them from the deck. Mainly it's just the Displacer Bot and then the Ancient Apparatus. And you have to sort of set those up by actually having these shuffle something in first, and then having these sort of tutor these cards to the hand. So it's like really awkward to set up sometimes. A lot of times you're just shuffling random cards into your deck and just hoping to draw this. This will be a sort of dead card until then. The payoff you get from this isn't too big compared to just like playing regular anti-tempo card draw and just hoping to draw cards from that, or even just playing like sort of vanilla, below vanilla cards to just try to get value out there, when these ones are just like dead in hand until you get the setup, and the payoff isn't really worth it in most of the cases. So next up, we got the Shion. This card's a very interesting card. You can use it in Constructed for sort of those 5 play point explosive plays and those heavy artifact unlimited decks. But unfortunately, Take 2, similar to the problem with the Augmentation, you don't have those sort of unlimited boards where you can just shuffle a billion artifacts into your deck and just draw them all by like turn 5, turn 6 with like Deuce or something. So a lot of the times you won't be able to sort of make use of the Accelerate buff, where you just buff a lot of artifact followers. And if you're only buffing normal followers, Portalcraft doesn't really make a lot of wide boards. They usually try to just reverse snowball a board and then drop a 3-drop. Keep doing that, and then eventually sort of stick stuff on the board and just win from that. They don't usually just try to snowball a game by just playing multiple followers alongside each other. Maybe if you end up getting like a bunch of bifurcating artifacts into the early game or something, then maybe you can make something really work. But if you're only just playing this for the Accelerate to get like a +1/+1 aura or something, you don't even get a body with it. It's generally not even strong, not even accounting for sort of the puppet synergies, where you can get like a 2 damage removal alongside it. So you're playing this mainly as sort of the 9 play point 7/7 with some pseudo invulnerability, as well as just the leader effect. The leader effect doesn't really matter as much. Sometimes it can like save you from some lethals if the opponent can't clear this and they have maybe some Storm Reach in hand. And then as well as sort of the immunability to destruction, sometimes that can end up saving you from some like hard removal that's not damage based. So in general, it's just sort of like a big fatty card that you sort of take as some late game, similar to sort of the 9 play point giant in the past, with that sort of similar immunity. So next up, we got the Shin, Lawful Light. It's a 2 play point 2/2 ward, so that's just a veteran Lancer stat line, just a solid enough card around here. But then it has like a freebie evo. It gives you the Chaos Awakens in hand, which is 4 play point +4/+4 stat buff. So you can just give this to puppets, give this to something else after it dies for some like extra free value. But if you put this onto the Shin, so maybe you treat this as like an evo 6-drop, you can actually transform this into a 10 play point 6/6 follower. Thing to note is you should actually crash with the Shin first if you can make a good trade with it, because once you transform it, it'll actually become a new follower, so it'll actually lose the rush if you're trying to like aim to get a trade off it being like that 6/6 body. So the thing that this body actually becomes like is a 6/6, like I said, and then it gets 3 different effects. It'll do one at random if you're before the 10th turn, or maybe if you're waiting until the 10th turn to do it, maybe you save an evo for it, maybe an alpha core for it. What it'll do is it'll do all 3 effects at once. So the 3 effects at once, like it doesn't matter, like mainly it's just free upside alongside the buff you put alongside it, as well as just a free evo value card. But But if you do manage to get it off, it'll give you a random destruction of a follower, it'll deal 4 to the opponent, heal 2 to the face, or it'll discount all cards in your hand by 1. And again, like I said, the 10th turn or later does all these. So this is definitely a really high value if you manage to sort of save it. As sort of like a late game sort of win condition, high value card. It's a bit less than the Maisha in the sense that this one can actually sort of win the game off some crazy storm potential lethal, but it's still like reasonable value in the early game sense. The Chaos Awakens is definitely much easier to use than the Purgation Blade in the early game. Just 4/4 onto a puppet, 4/4 onto something for either just trading in or just giving you extra reach, extra pressure. So this is definitely like a very solid card alongside the Paracelsus. It's just a Evo specific 2-drop that gives you extra value for evolving like an early drop. So the Puppet Troop Master, this card's a very interesting card that came in the mini expansion. It has non-vanilla Evo, but it doesn't matter most of the time, just because early on it's just the Angel of Word. Most of the times you'll be trying to save this turn like 3, 4, even 5, as long as this can crash into maybe a 5-4, 5-3, because you can always use the puppet alongside it. As long as you trade against the biggest thing, you'll have so much value set up for the rest of the game. It's sort of like the New Orders kind of effect, where it gives you like sort of flips your deck, changes it around. But in this case, you actually keep all the normal cards in your deck, and more importantly, you keep the normal cards in your hand. So as long as you have like a setup of like reasonable random removal and just random vanilla drops to sort of set yourself up for those situations where you might draw like at the end of the turn you draw a puppet, and at the start of the turn you draw a puppet, then you can actually have maybe like 1 or 2 turns where even if those situations do come up, it's still fine because you have enough value in your hand to actually like play on curve. Sometimes it can screw you over, maybe you draw like 6 puppets in a row, like counting like the end of the turn and the start of your turn. But most of the times on average you'll draw like 1 puppet a turn alongside just 1 value card a turn, and this card just becomes a crazy draw engine. You just evo it, the earlier you evo it the better, of course, and then you just sort of win the game off the incremental value of just getting basically a free ping a turn and just getting the extra card draw as well. Sometimes it can just draw 2 followers a turn or 2 random spells a turn, and you can just beat your opponent off the really strong leader effect that this gives. Not to mention that this is just a standard Angel of Word / 3 play point 2/2, just draw a puppet. That's decent value enough even if you don't get the Evo effect off. So the Bafflement, I considered putting it here as sort of a joke, but no, this card's incredibly high value. Just the fact that it sort of fuels itself. Like in theory, if this card's like your 30th pick, maybe stuff isn't as boosted. Like right now you have like the Mecha Gun Wielder, the Displacer Bot, and the Prototype Warrior, sort of your Machina picks. And those are like all reasonably fine. In Constructed, you could just throw like 3 of these into your deck and this would just transform all your other Machina, like all your other Bafflements into basically the 3 Gundam cards that this card shuffles into the deck, or changes your Machina cards into. But sometimes in Take 2, maybe you actually don't end up drafting a lot of these. Like maybe you don't want to draft the Mecha Gun for whatever reason. Maybe you don't end up with Prototype Warriors, and then maybe you don't want to draft this over like the other 5 drops. So sometimes if this is sort of like late in the pick and you only have like 1 Machina cards and no Machina cards, then this card obviously does nothing. It's sort of that Despondent Chimera, just 6.66 vanilla. But in other cases, it's sort of like worth the risk in the sense that if you have 1 or 2 Machinas in your draft in your deck, then converting one into like any of these 3 cards is super amazing. One of it's 8/7 rush that double attacks, and then it doesn't take damage, similar to an Odin. The other one's just a 5/11 that pings for 4 to a random follower, and then hits for 6 to the opponent's face. And the last one's just a really solid body. It just puts a 2 4/4 Machina assembly droids on board, and then it boosts all the Machinas as well. And it does that at every end of turn, so that you have to clear that and then clear the assembly droids as well. So all those cards are just ridiculous value. And then the fact that this, you can just play it down on 6. This is your last Evo turn, so you can actually make use of the Evo effect and then just fetch it into your hand is just like really amazing. Just giving you a really big body into turn 6. Just sometimes even a New Order is like evolving on 6 is good enough. And the fact that this is a very big stat line on 6, as well as just giving you a massive value card for turn 8, is just a really good reason to draft it. So the Goliath, as a joke, this card is a Dragoncraft card that was too good in the Disdain / Dragoncraft archetype, so they just made it a Portalcraft card. Because the Golian Howl is actually sort of a Disdain card. It pings 1 to the self, and then, well, you don't have to use it on this card. You can ping 1 to something and then deal 2 to something, so it's like 0 play point, Disdainful Rending. And the Aura's a 3 play point, give 2/2 to all your Machinas. It's worth noting this is also Machina, so you can actually treat this as sort of like a 10 drop as well. I forgot to write it, or maybe it got lost in the template, but this has Rush, so you can actually just rush this into something. So like 4/7 trades into a lot of things respectively, like post evo things, just a bunch of like random damage stuff. So you hit into that, and then you use the Gillian Aura as well. This will survive most of the time just because of its high stat line, and then you'll have 2 assembly droids on board. If all these stick, you can use the Aura on it, so it'll just give 2-2 to this, as well as give 2-2 to your other assembly droid. So that's like a really snowball board just out of nothing. And the fact that you can do so much in turn 7, just rush this in and then use the Gillian Howl, and then that'll give you 2 assembly droids, and then this thing will most likely live on board. Just a really good board flood, really good removal options. Sort of a more offensive version of the Zwei. The problem with the Zwei was sometimes it was a very defensive, where you didn't want to use it because of the Zwei. The Victoria it spawned was sort of vulnerable, just 3-1, it randomly get pinged away after. And if the opponent wasn't really making big boards because you were Portalcraft, the Zwei was sort of like bad in the sense that it was sort of easy to clear and it didn't really build board as much. So this one builds board a lot better in the sense that you can pressure with it after, as well as being like a really amazing 10 drop with the Gillian aura sort of buffing all the cards that you spawn with the Goliath living. So moving on to the changelog, we got the Orb of Desecration. This is mainly just the consistency of getting this off. Playing this into the early game, you still have to line up your curve. You're still down a card from playing this card. This could have been just a standard good stuff value card that you play on 2, play on 5, something like that you could have played as soon as you had the play points for, where this one you have to build up to sort of the reward. And then sometimes by turn 7, turn 8, turn 9, it doesn't even proc, just because you either don't have enough puppet generation or your curve doesn't line up, that enough stuff died, enough stuff evo to actually get this off. And even the enhanced 5 fallback, you still have to wait a long time. Evos are burned by then, so you're just playing a bunch of mid-range followers against each other, and you have to wait like a couple turns of natural cooldown combined with those followers dying to actually get the thing to proc. So being slow in the early game, slow in the mid game makes this bad compared to just standard good stuff you can draft. So the Destructive Refrain bumped up by 1 just because it's sort of that niche AoE removal that no one really plays around, because they can't really afford to play around it against Portalcraft sometimes, just because of puppets and just random good mid-range stuff. They try to go really wide against you and just dodge the Basilius or make sure you don't have the Evo for the Basilius, and then they try to win the game just because you can't like Captivating Conductor, like 5 things on board. So they might leave a random like Displacer Bot, some random like 5-6 drop on board, and just make you do inefficient trades, or just try to all-in you from there, and you can punish them by playing the Refrain, or you can just play it on a 2-drop, 3-drop, and just get a really premium AoE. There's not too much opportunity cost to actually like playing this. It's just sacrificing 2 cards to get a really premium AoE that sometimes wins you the game off that. The World Gate bumped up by 1, mainly just because of the Monica. You want to banish the Mora. This gives you sort of that niche option to actually banish it. It's actually a bit better now because of the Displacer Bot. Gives you an avenue to actually fetch the Guard form or the Strike form, so that's extra value that you can get off from your deck, as well as just a decent banish removal that's good for that tech option, like I said, with the Mora. The Sylvia bumped up by 1, mainly because of the Xian. These are sort of competing slots. This one can't be targeted, similar to can't be destroyed. And this one's a lot more proactive, just being a really good top deck, 4/4 wards, good enough stats, and just pinging forward to any enemy. It can be extra reach potential, just as well as just value clearing something. And then as the extra contingency, you can actually just accelerate 3, hit that reset button, and just clear most things on board, and just get a really premium AoE. Last up for the changelog is Lococo. This card bumped up mainly because of sort of the 2-drop competition. This one's the highest value 2-drop in the terms of the value department of not needing to Evo, as well as Portalcraft's lacking of really big hard removal. They have the Conductor, but that one's like situational to get off, as well as the Altar Plane. Even though this is a banish effect, this one's a transform effect. This one can't really hit really big stuff. The fact that this can hit really big followers that sometimes creep into the format, as well as just transform some really problematic last words, makes this card sort of get the bump up. So moving on to the silver picks, we got the Alpha Core. Unfortunately for Portalcraft, this one's not too good because they could benefit from stuff like the Sylvia Evo, getting a Evo for the Shin or the Maisha. So this one sort of got the extra contingency of giving you back 2 play points for playing this in the early game. But if you play this in the early game, what happens is you've played 3 play points to do nothing on board and nothing to expand the board. You've only shuffled a bunch of artifacts into your deck, which you're probably already doing with just your standard 2 drops, maybe your standard 3 drops. So maybe you can get the combo where you line this up with the Displacer Bot and you can sort of recover from that anti-tempo. But playing this in the early game, for the most part, just to shuffle artifacts, we've already seen a lot of sort of do nothing shuffle artifacts fall on the way. Shuffle artifact cards fall on the wayside. This card's sort of another one of them if you play this card in the 3 play point sense, even with the recovery of play points. But if you play this card as a 7-drop, sometimes maybe you can line up where you maybe get the Sylvia clear or the Shin or the Maisha to get that really premium Evo, especially if you're going first and you can't really afford to keep the Evos. That sometimes it can be worth the consideration to sort of line up those combos. Mainly it's just because this will most likely be a 1-of in your deck, and a lot of these rares, they might not be the highest value of cards to actually like keep or get draft multiples of these. So just lining these up sometimes is hard, but it is draftable in the sense that maybe you don't want to draft the Disciple, or maybe you have like other cards that you're drafting this over, like the mechanization, or drafting this alongside something like a Basilius or a Nicola, that it ends up being fine because it's still Evo recovery, it's still decent value. Next up, we got the Mecha Gun Wielder. So 1-drops in Portalcraft are actually surprisingly playable in the sense that sometimes the opponents just don't expect you to play sort of an aggressive gameplay. You can go like 1-drop, 2-drop into like a creeping slime, and you can just out aggro people that expect you to play sort of a value or late game gameplay, and sometimes you can win games off that. And the fact that this is like good enough most of the times, that like 2-drops, 3-drops that randomly shuffle artifacts into your deck, if you can weave these cards alongside this, maybe even like drafting some of the bad ones / more situational ones, end up being better just because this card's in your deck. And then into the late game, this card can just draw you 2, because most of the times you have like 1 or 2 artifacts just from your random shuffles. It's just the random downside of sometimes you not shuffling enough artifacts, you not having good draw order, that this ends up being sort of like a dead like 1 play point draw that's like very anti-value, in the sense that this card didn't give you value, and it's just a 1 play point 1/1 that's sort of rotting in your hand until you can actually like get one of these cards to shuffle that sort of holds this card back. Otherwise, the more like artifact synergistic, artifact heavy deck your deck is, the more this card sort of bumps up in the value sense. So the Displacer Bot, this card's definitely very strong in the 5-drop department. Just a very solid artifact tutor card with not too much downside. It comes down after your artifact shufflers, so your 2-drops, 3-drops, anything that shuffle. This card gives you the Acceleratium to actually give you that rush to actually make those artifacts impactful right away, as well as just it being a random freebie. It doesn't spawn it, luckily, so you'll actually be able to play it whenever you can just play it alongside the artifacts you draw, or you can save it for more artifacts later. And then just the freebie value you have attached to it, just drawing one of your high premium artifacts from your deck, definitely one of the go-to 5-drops to go to. Just 5 play point 4/5, just vanilla enough stats and free value attached to it. It's only down here mainly because of 5-drop competition, as well as just sometimes the inconsistency of not having these cards shuffled something to your deck, as well as just drafting random drafts that you end up with a lot of neutral 2-drops, a lot of random 2-drops that aren't artifact shufflers. While they are still plentiful in the pool, sometimes it doesn't line up or it doesn't happen, that this card can be sort of vanilla in that sense. So as for the changelog, we don't have much. The mechanization, you can maybe consider it with like Mega Gun Wielder. That's mainly like constructed level, where you have a lot more sort of ways to tutor these cards that you shuffle into your deck, because this card's still like anti-tempo in that sense. The destruction card got a lot worse, mainly because we don't have cards like junk in the pool anymore, so it sort of like stays around here. You can be sort of like anti-tempo and then draw a lot of cards value-wise, but a lot of times the opponent can sort of get back into the game just because you sacrifice sort of a post-evo follower or just a low drop that you draw off it. It's sort of that Demoneer effect that you just draft a 1 of if you really want that sort of effect. Captivating Conductor sort of went up, mainly just because it just deals with a decent enough threats, just a decent double AoE to clear a bunch of random mid-range followers. The Altar Plane went down, and also the Angel went down, mainly similar problem with the Blood one, where these cards are all like deserving of being like around here, but I want to sort of separate it. Basilius is obviously the best. These cards are like around near the top. The Displacer Bot scales higher with just a high density artifact deck. This one's like sort of like fine just because the Viola is sort of like a similar effect. It's just a 3/3 body with free upside attached. And the Altar Plane can be like sort of situational in the sense that it's sort of expensive for the things it does, and if it doesn't draw you any artifacts from the deck, then it's definitely under vanilla, even though it does have a banish effect attached. So you can bump it down in that sense. But you could always bump like this one up and then like this one up if you're artifact heavy. But it's mainly just sort of separating the pool of like the vanilla good stuff that you can definitely draft in the form of the Nicola, the Lad, and the Basilius. So I'm going to talk about the changelog of the bronzes first because of sort of the massive changes that it had. Mainly just the less inclination to pick the small drops, as well as the major shift to pick the big drops. The Automaton and the Draco Marionette, these cards are sort of in tandem with each other. The Marionette benefited the most just because it's probably one of the best standalone 8-drops compared to something like an Abyss Summoner. It's one of the actual playable sort of late drops just because it gives you a lot of value in the late game, a lot of chip damage, and sort of less removal in the pool of sort of other crafts makes this a lot safer to draft. The Automaton's a bit interesting. This card's bumping up because Mia's actually very similar to it. This card proactively, you get the puppets right away, and it's like a similar body, 5/5 compared to 5/7, and a lot of the times war doesn't matter compared to sort of the safety of being able to actually get you the pings lit earlier, and also like the freebie of this being like a reasonably solid 2-drop. It means sort of like the automaton is like less needed, but it's still like a reasonable card. If you land this on 7 with or without an Evo, and the opponent doesn't have a good answer for it, it's definitely a very strong card. The Black Iron, just a random extra good value card sort of in the pool with the Prototype Warrior. You still had like the Knower before, but it's just like more draftable in the sense that, oh, it's like a 6-drop, we're gonna lose Basilius soon, and just a reasonable like 6-drop to take in the silver slot. The Zealot went down, mainly just less pressure to actually pick it. We have the Displacer bot now. We still have like reasonable 5-drops here. Enkidu is a really good aggressive drop. This one's sort of the best value drop. It just went down just because of less pressure to sort of pick it as like a really good standalone bronze card. And then finally we had the Jessica. It went down similar to the Servant of Destruction. This one doesn't go down because it's still good enough. It still has a low potential of hitting just a post-evo follower. Sometimes you can line up a puppet with this. But the Jessica went down mainly just because you can't line up stuff like the Junks or the Cruel Puppeteer, just generating a lot of puppets. Most of the times the puppets you generate now will sort of come down immediately. So this card doesn't have that avenue to actually buff the puppet to get that freebie ping too. Sometimes it can end up being beneficial just hitting a Portalcraft follower, just chip in for extra damage, or randomly forcing your opponent to target it. Sometimes it ends up being enough, but it's sort of like vanilla in that sense. It's still fine as sort of like a 3.32. So moving on to the new bronze picks, we got the Pull the Strings. It's mainly the inconsistency and the awkwardness of sort of getting this card off. In the early game, you're still like trading with your opponent. Sometimes you're just trading 2-drop into a 3-drop, 3-drop. So you won't actually have sort of a 2-drop living by turn 4. And then sometimes you don't even want to play this in inopportune moments. You're just converting your opponent's 2-drop into your own. So it's like 2 play point swing on both sides. So it is technically worth the cost, but you definitely do want to line this up so it resonates and you get the puppet for either the extra value with clearing something immediately or just holding the puppet in your hand. So the awkwardness of sort of getting this card off, as well as lining this up with a good target. Most of the times it'll just be a post-evo target if you're really, really lucky, but then just hitting like a random vanilla follower and just getting into your side. It's still like anti-vanilla in the sense that it's clunky to get off and it doesn't benefit you a lot of the times compared to actual like random good removal. So next up we got the Prototype Warrior. So this card's very interesting, just 2 play point 2/2 and then shuffle the 2 bifurcatings into your deck. I think I explained it with the augmentation. It's the 3 play point 2/2 that makes another 2/2, so like a 3 play point conjure twosome. And the fact that it's just random board flood for Portalcraft is very nice. If you can like tutor this sort of into the early game, you can actually make some really strong board pushes just because the conjure twosomes are so efficient being 3 play point cost. Just additional synergy of being a Machina card sometimes does come into play with something like the Balfomet, and just being like a standard vanilla 2-drop. You're just picking all these just because they're good filler 2s. In general cases, you don't really care which artifacts you shuffle in the deck just because they're reasonably strong, reasonably efficient cards. So this card is definitely just a nice complement alongside the other 2-drops. So the Creeping Slime, I'm really glad that this card's in the pool because it gives sort of an early game aggressive card for Portalcraft to have. They have like late game stuff like the Draco Marionette and like Enkidu, but it's sort of like an early game push to say, oh, you can play an aggressive game and maybe punish your opponent for being too slow against you. So just 3 play point 2/2. This card's similar to sort of like a Vagabond Frog or some sort of like the Trinity Dragons in Dragoncraft, where if the opponent can't sort of deal with this in the early game and you're sort of pressuring board, just playing good stuff on board, and this card sort of sticks on board, you can either Evo this, buff this, and then just randomly chip in for face. It's got the extra contingency of just being a freebie Evo on 6. Just 6/6 or 6 play point 4/4 can't be attacked. It's almost as good as just a 5 play point 4/4 rush. And you can never underestimate just freebie Evos just crashing into Goliaths and then living and then being even more annoying to clear because you can't clear this with like puppets, just random stuff like residual stuff on board that other rushes could be cleared with after. The opponent actually has to commit real pings, real removals to actually clear this card. That this card can sometimes just run away with the game, like dealing 4 to 8 damage to the opponent's face, and they can't actually clear it. So last up we got the Mia, comparable to the Silver Automaton, like I've said before, just a really good value of just playing it as a 7 play point 5/5 that pings 2 or you can bank them in your hand. Similarly to the case where you just play it as a 2-drop, 2 play point 2/2, play a 2 or 3-drop alongside it, Evo it, and then you get the puppet to instantly get that premium extra clear. It's targeted as well, and then you can always bank it in the hand if there's nothing to remove. Just an excellent value piece that sort of adds to Portalcraft's puzzle and just a really high value 2-drop compared to the sort of the other 2-drops they have. So I guess that wraps it up for the Portalcraft cards, and I'll see you on the next one.